Episode 2 Killing Carl Shelton. Illinois in 1947 was, like the rest of the nation, weary from World War II. Death, however, was still present and accounted for. Two tragedies headlined the year's events and left a lasting impression on all who survived. On March the 25th, Centralia No. 5 coal mine exploded 300 feet down, killing 111 miners. From that time forward, the children of Centralia were referred to as the Orphans of the Storm. On October 23rd, Black Charlie Harris, Roy Arms, and Dale Stamper killed Carl Shelton, the unquestioned leader of the Shelton gang. His murder signaled a changing of the guard in Illinois gang circles. The Chicago outfit, led by Paul Ricca, known as the Waiter, and Joe Batters, whose real name was Tony Accardo, had allied with the St. Louis Syndicate, led by Murray Humphreys and Buster Wortman. They were now in a position to take over the entire state. It took them 25 years, but they finally succeeded in eliminating their number one enemy and constant roadblock. Wortman liked to say, "We cut off the head of the snake." Here's how it happened. The relationship between the Shelton gang, Carl, Earl, and Bernie, and the outfit, Al Capone and Frank Nitti, gained traction in 1930 when the two agreed to meet at the Parkway Tavern in Peoria to divide up the state. The Sheltons chose the Parkway because the owner was a customer and they knew the terrain. Each side showed up late that morning in 1930 with all hands on deck. The Capones were represented by Al, Frank Nitti, Jake Guzik, Fred Killer Burke, and Anthony Joe Batters Accardo. Burke and Batters were the shooters in the recent St. Valentine's Day massacre that had killed 7 of Bugs Moran's Northside mob. Carl, Earl, and Bernie were bolstered by Ray Walker and Blackie Arms. The 5 men sat across from their visitors in the main bar room. A large conference table separated the two sides. The 10 men stared at each other intently, each seeking to uncover any weakness that might manifest. No one blinked. Carl was making a suggestion when Al intervened. "Since we are the larger of the two organizations, we intend to make the first proposal," he said. "Fine by us," replied Carl. Earl nodded his head. Bernie was busy staring down Frank Nitti, who was sitting directly across from him at the end of the table. Frank was staring back. "It seems," said Al, casting his gaze to include his men, "that Peoria would be a natural dividing line between our two organizations. We have all fought hard battles, and the time has come to prosper. Do you agree, Mr. Carl Shelton?" "What do you think, brothers?" said Carl. Earl nodded. "Agreed," he said. Bernie was still focused on Frank Nitti, the outfit's stone-cold killer. "You staring at me, Frank?" he asked, leaning over the table to be a little closer. His voice was deep and dripped icicles. "Yeah, I am," replied Nitti. "Maybe you just don't like me," said Bernie. He inched closer. "I don't think I do," said Nitti. "That's okay with me," said Bernie. "We'll probably never see each other again, except maybe in the joint or the paper. Just remember one thing, Frank. Even though you may consider yourself the baddest motherfucker on the planet, I've walked through better men than you to get to a fight." Frank Nitti came unglued. Put your gun on the table, you fucking hillbilly cocksucker," he said. He stood up facing Bernie, unholstered his automatic, and laid it on the table. Bernie looked at his brothers. "This all right with you, brothers? Me kicking the shit out of this punk won't derail our agreement? You, Mr. Capone?" Al knew better than to stand between Frank and anything. Nobody said the word. "I'll take that as a yes," said Bernie. He took off his shoulder holster and laid it beside Nitti's. In one lightning move, Bernie launched himself, hitting Nitti squarely in the throat with a straight right. As Nitti gagged and clutched his neck, Bernie spun him halfway around and put him into a rear naked choke. Nitti flailed and attempted to break the hold, but that did not happen. As consciousness began to wane, with his body starved for air, Frank managed to pull his waist knife and stab backward at Bernie, who was not interested in releasing his hold on the mobster who had savagely ended the lives of so many people. Bernie smiled as the blade grazed his thigh, slicing open a 2-inch cut. Before Nitty could turn his advantage into possibility, Bernie hit the man in his right kidney with such force that the blade dropped from Nitty's hands as he collapsed in a heap, soiling himself as he fell. Bernie looked down on him with disdain. "That all you got, big man?" he said. Guzik, Burke, and Batters pushed back their chairs and rushed to assist their fallen comrade. They helped Frank to his feet, but he couldn't stand. The stench was overwhelming. "We got a bathroom over there in the corner," said Carl. "Why don't you clean him up? And if there's nothing left to discuss, we'll call it a day." Al Capone had sat silently watching the spectacle of his right-hand man play out. Their agreed-upon code word for violence, Teresa, his mother's name, was not permissible here. The outfit had heard stories about Bernie Shelton, and now they knew the tales were true. Al admired violence in its purest form, especially when it was a retaliatory response. Shelton had asked for the confrontation, but he sure as hell had dealt with it. "No problems here, Mr. Shelton. We'll be on our way once our man can travel." "Peoria it is," said Capone. He rose from his chair and started for the door. Nitty was walking, hunched over, a handkerchief at his mouth. Had to be his kidneys, thought Carl. He'd seen Bernie in action before. There were some streets in life you just didn't cross. That was the only time Carl, Earl, Bernie, Ray, and Blackie would ever see Al Capone. In 1931, Al was convicted of tax evasion by Elliot Ness and the Untouchables and sent to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, then on to Alcatraz, where he spent the better part of a decade. When he was released in 1939, he was quite ill, with tertiary syphilis. He lived until January 1947 and died at the age of 48 at home with his family. Frank Nitti had taken over the outfit upon Al's imprisonment and never forgot the Sheltons. It was decided years before the actual event that when the opportunity presented itself, there would be a reckoning. Carl, Earl, and Bernie Shelton were men marked for execution. Frank Nitti left Peoria with a new attitude. The brothers left the meeting with a clear understanding of the agreement. "They want what we've got," said Carl. "But they're up to their eyeballs in feds and rivals, so we're safe for a moment." "There's no agreement those fellows will ever make that's worth the paper it's written on," said Earl. "Keep selling them booze, brother," said Carl. "It's good to be needed." "Sometimes better than wanted," said Earl. "I should have killed him," said Bernie. "Better that you didn't, brother," said Earl. The Shelton brothers went about their business and continued to prosper with East St. Louis as their home base. 1930 was still rolling along when Jerome Mooney was elected sheriff of St. Clair County, which housed East St. Louis in its wide-open gambling and vice district known as the Valley. There, years ago, the Sheltons had met Art and Bessie Newman, who had gravitated south to eventually hook up with Charlie Berger. Berger had gotten himself hung in 1928 for killing Joe Adams, the mayor of West City, a small town attached to Benton, Illinois' flank. The Sheltons had waged war with Berger and his Shady Rest crew until the state of Illinois ended that drama. Getting kicked out of East St. Louis wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to the Sheltons. By 1934, they were settled within the friendly confines of Peoria. Mooney had won and was rewarded shortly thereafter when he also won the race for mayor of East St. Louis. The Sheltons, forced to look elsewhere, stored their liquor shipments in Metropolis, Illinois with Miller Dairy. Paul Miller, the owner, was a good friend of Carl Shelton's. They enlisted an old friend, Shot Winchester, who owned the Casino Club in Olmsted and would later own Club Winchester there, to help move that booze northward to waiting accounts. With the storage and delivery issue temporarily solved, the Sheltons bought the Parkway Tavern in Peoria, where their showdown with Capone had occurred a few years earlier. Bernie and his girlfriend, Carrie Stevenson, were already living nearby on a horse farm they called Happy Hollow. The boys took to Peoria like a duck to water, and by 1935 had more than 1,400 gambling and liquor accounts throughout southern Illinois under their control. In 1940, Earl, deciding he had had enough of the rackets, left Peoria and retired to farm his holdings at Pond Creek. Between them, Carl and Earl would own 4,000 acres of prime farmland and mineral rights by 1947, the year Carl was murdered. The outfit saw Earl's retirement as a weakness, and 3 years later, in 1943, called a meeting to discuss their options. "Have Buster Wortman and Charlie Harris come over," said Paul Ricca, who now ran the outfit with Al Capone out of the picture and Frank Nitti dead, shot by himself and the Chicago police in March of that year. Capone was living out his last days and barely alive. Charlie Harris was no longer in the Shelton fold. He'd been screwed over 2 times too many by the brothers, who had sent him counterfeit money to pay for a liquor shipment back in the 30s, which cost him 10 years in Leavenworth. Paroled in 1937, Charlie went home to Pond Creek. In the fall of 1940, Charlie had attempted to buy 243 acres of prime farmland being sold by the Corbin family. His mistake was telling Carl about it. Carl instituted a swindle, and Charlie was furious. Charlie eventually got the land, but the die was cast forever. "Time for me to let go of him," he said. "A man can only take so much." Charlie himself was often contrasted with Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A small, dapper, well-dressed man, he was credited by J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI with at least 25 kills. He was a vital cog in the 50-strong Harris-Vaughn clan that counted themselves among, if not the first, settlers to put down roots in the Pond Creek area. Charlie was proud of his ancestry, but above all else, Black Charlie Harris, as he became known, hated the Sheltons. Carl was busy winning the favor of Ed Woodruff, the recently once again elected mayor of Peoria, when the call went out. Buster contacted Charlie, who was more than happy to hear what Ricca had to say about Carl Shelton. On a sunny day in mid-October 1943, Havana, the fishing capital of Illinois, opened its arms to several of the most notorious criminals to ever walk its soil. The town was located in Mason County and got its name from the island of Belle Rose, which sat at the mouth of the Spoon River. The island was shaped like Cuba, and one day the locals started calling their town Havana. It stuck. The meeting of Ricca, Guzik, Wortman, and Harris did not cause so much as a ripple in the Illinois River, which flowed just outside the River Bend Inn, where their rendezvous occurred. 3 killers and an accountant sat down together. "We have been thwarted by the Sheltons," said Ricca. "What do you want to do about it?" asked Charlie. "Make it him go away," replied Ricca. It was a line he would become famous for over the next 40 years. "Kill them all." Ricca continued. "The 3 Sheltons. Let's call them number 1, number 2, and number 3. Each has a price of $10,000 on their heads, dead or alive." Charlie Harris smiled. To be so rewarded was a fitting synopsis. Time passed, proving the adage that nothing lasts forever. World War II mercifully ended in 1945 with the bombing of Nagasaki, which was, by itself, not merciful at all. Peoria was still booming. Mayor Woodruff was still in power, and the coffers were full. But sadly, for the Sheltons, the mayor was mistaken about the people's position regarding prostitution. Along came Carl Treble, a laundry operator who in 1945 became the new mayor. Treble clamped down and made it abundantly clear to Carl that the glory days were over. Without much of a fight, Carl turned the business over to Bernie, who moved operations control to the Parkway Tavern on Farmington Road, outside the city limits, where the showdown of 1930 had occurred. Carl joined Earl on the farm. The outfit smelled blood. The head of the snake, number 1, had stepped aside. Ricca called Buster, and soon enough they sat together in the outfit's Chicago headquarters. "What's the plan?" asked Buster. Let's make him an offer he can't refuse, said Ricka. The offer was either to accept a 100% buyout based on current revenues or 45% for 3 years. Cotton Eppelsheimer, whose real name was Frank Mara, made a phone call, and soon after Bernie, Carl, and Cotton met at the St. Nicholas Hotel in Springfield. Cotton laid out the plan. Carl said no. The die was cast. The gloves came off. There was going to be blood, but it would not be spilled overnight. Ricka was fuming. 2 years had passed since the contract went out, and those fucking Sheltons were still walking upright on the planet. He let Buster know how he felt. Buster relayed the message. You're going to have to take 'em out, and you need to be getting it done, he told Black Charlie Harris. Charlie was back from a hit and had been invited to the moat house Buster called home. Why are you telling me this? Asked Charlie. He'd spent the last 2 years taking out Sheltonites. When the time was right, it would happen. Charlie knew Carl's routine. He had none. He was still riding all over Pond Creek in that Jeep of his. The two men shared information about the recently deceased members of the tribe, but Black Charlie left more pissed off than when he was summoned to Collinsville. Soon after, Ray Walker and Little Earl Shelton, combat veteran and son of Dalta, beat the holy hell out of Virgil Vaughn, whom Carl suspected of stealing some of his prized Angus cattle. When Charlie heard this news, he was furious. A few hours later, he was in St. Louis, huddled with Buster Wortman, Jake Guzik, and their associates. I'm ready for the first installment, said Charlie, his cold, steel-gray eyes unblinking. Buster went to the safe, pulled out $5,000, and handed it to Charlie. Fully refundable in the case of a fuck-up, said Charlie. Wortman smiled and nodded. I need 2 men, a machine gun, and a car, said Charlie. Charlie's wish was fulfilled, and 2 days later, he was in Pond Creek with Roy Arms and Dale Stamper, both proven killers. Charlie knew the Pond Creek bottoms like the back of his hand. Most of the area was tillable and was being actively farmed. Tracts were mostly planted in corn and beans. With harvest time approaching, some farmers were already in the fields taking out their crops. Whatever site he chose had to be a route that was frequently traveled by Carl and his 2 ever-present bodyguards. Minimal human activity would be helpful. Being as far removed as possible from a farmhouse was also a plus. The 3 men had been surveilling the bottoms for possible ambush sites for hours when the gravel road they were currently on turned slightly to the north and then dipped, crossing a ditch that served to channel storm runoff from adjacent fields. This particular road, known as Pond Creek Road, had a small bridge that ran across the channel cut. On both sides of the road, dense foliage covered the stream bed. Visibility was limited around the bridge, and on the east side, a seldom used tractor crossing was accessible from the roadbed itself. Charlie drove the black Ford sedan down the crossing and parked it behind the tree line. He walked back up to the road and widened his view. The car could not be seen from the roadway, and if he turned it around and backed it in, the way he came in became the way out. Their escape route could be either north or south, which would become crucial if the bridgeway became blocked. The area was vacant. No farming activity was underway. Looks like we could park the car on the other side of the bridge and set up just off the bridge entrance, said Charlie. Tony Arms pointed in the direction of the dense underbrush a few feet off the roadway. Be hard to miss from there, said Stamper. With the ambush site in hand, Charlie knew that some long, sleepless hours of nothing were in his future. There would have to be surveillance on Carl's house from sunup to whenever he set out for his fields. He and his family would handle that task. Carl Shelton was edgy and felt off. Something wasn't right. He walked outside. His dog Scout was barking his head off and would not shut up. Carl tried everything to quiet him down, but to no avail. The old black dog just locked himself onto the front porch and howled. Never stopped looking east toward Dalta's place. Hey, old boy, what's up with you? What's wrong? Scout stopped howling and licked his face. Carl called him kisses. He loved animals, and Scout was his very favorite. He had rescued Scout from beside Pond Creek Road on a dreary winter afternoon, just after he came back to live and farm. Someone had dumped the dog and then shot him while he ran for his life. We got to leave, boy. You're just going to have to stay here until I get back. Normally, Scout would pile into the Jeep or whatever Carl was driving, and off they'd go. The two of them were inseparable. See you, buddy. Not this time. Carl rubbed the old dog's head and got another kiss. Morning was coming later as winter approached, and October 23rd, 1947 had all the appearances of a day that would end with unfinished tasks. Best to get going as soon as possible. Carl went inside and, picking up the phone, called Frank Bora, a Fairfield businessman who had handled private matters for Carl on numerous occasions. Frank, said Carl, I'm coming to town later on to see you, but I have some farm business to attend to first. Can we schedule some time? What's on your mind, Carl? Asked Frank. It's time I made a will. I'm not getting any younger, and all this land needs to be passed on to the kids. I can't fathom dying intestate. There is little Carl, little Earl, Ray, and of course the brothers. Got to get it done. What's driving the ship, Carl? I've tried more than once to get you inside these doors with no success. I don't know, said Carl. Things are happening. There was the Vaughn business, the cattle, you know. I know you nearly killed him, replied Bora. The two men hung up, and Carl headed out the door. Scout Dog was still howling when what sounded like a car horn went off. You hear that, Ray? Asked little Earl. Yeah, replied Walker. Come on, boys, be quick about it. We're going to Roy's to pick up the Jeep. Roy Shelton was back on the farm with his brothers, having weathered numerous stays at Menard's State Penitentiary for auto theft. Wait while we get our stuff, yelled Ray. Don't bother, replied Carl. We're just going to be gone for a minute. The stuff was guns, weapons. Ray and little Earl never left home without them. Just this once. The men piled into the flatbed Ford truck, and 15 minutes later, Roy's farm came into sight. Carl hopped out, fired up the Jeep, and took off. From seemingly out of nowhere, a loud honk followed by two short blasts echoed across the rolling terrain. It seemed to come from somewhere up the road, near the small bridge that was on their way to town. What was that? Asked little Earl. Sounded like a car horn to me, said Ray. Then it happened again. Ray pulled the truck to a halt. Carl saw him stop and turned around in his seat. What are you stopping for, Ray? Asked Carl. Did you hear that, boss? Replied Ray. You mean the honking? Yeah, I heard it. Now let's go. We're going to be late. Ray Walker shook his head. His instincts told him to wait and stop Carl, but hell, no one knew where they were going or why. They were just picking up a tractor in town and taking it to one of Carl's farms. Simple as that. Carl set out with Ray and little Earl some 50 feet behind. The gravel roads in Pond Creek were dusty most of the year, and Ray hated eating dust. Carl was moving out. He must have a burr up his ass, said Ray. That's just Uncle Carl, said little Earl, trying to cram 2 days' work into one. They had the Jeep clearly in sight as it approached the bridge and began to cross. Just then, a deafening volley of bullets came from the dense foliage on the east side of the road, knocking Carl sideways and out of his vehicle. Ray slammed the brakes on the truck, which screeched to a halt. He and little Earl threw themselves into a ditch near the bridge. What they saw next stayed with the two men for the rest of their lives. Uncle Carl, shot to hell, was standing in the roadway, waving his .45 pistol and firing wildly. Get in the goddamn ditch, Carl, yelled Ray at the top of his lungs. As Carl stumbled forward, Ray could see a man step up from his cover onto the roadway. He was average in size, said Ray. Wore a gray suit, hat, and dress shirt. No tie. I didn't recognize him. He had a rifle or a shotgun. I couldn't tell which. Someone started firing at us, so we hunkered down in the ditch. I looked back up once they had stopped firing at us, said little Earl. I saw Charlie Harris as clear as day. standing to the right of the other man. Uncle Carl was still standing, and I heard him say, as plain as day, "Don't shoot me any more, Charlie. You killed me already." A barrage of gunfire followed. Carl fell into the ditch beside the culvert. "When the shooting ended," said Ray, "a black 1946 Ford sedan barreled out of the side road and headed south. There was more than one man in the car. When we came out from the ditch, another man began running north away from the bridge. It was Charlie Harris." "Yeah, it was Black Charlie," said little Earl. "It was him." Black Charlie Harris, Dale Stamper, and Tony Arms were heroes that night in Collinsville as they accepted their pay from Buster Wortman. The murder of Carl Shelton was reported nationally. No one, however, so much as spent one day in jail for committing the crime. The funeral of Carl Shelton was attended by roughly 2,000 onlookers. It was an event. Mother Agnes wept. She could not bring her favorite son back. As he was lowered into his final resting place, Agnes turned to Bernie and said, "Son, you and your brother need to put that vicious little bastard down." Charlie Harris, sadly enough, was nowhere to be found. It would be decades before life returned to normal at the Merriam Crossroads. The king was dead.